In the twilight of 1917, the world as it was known was vanishing beneath the weight of millions of tons of steel and the stench of upturned earth. The Great War, which was supposed to be swift and glorious, had transformed into an industrial meat grinder that swallowed entire generations. In the plains of France, stagnation was the only law, and death was a bureaucratic routine dictated by bolt-action rifles and fixed machine guns that turned any advance into a collective suicide. European empires were exhausted, bleeding their youth to the last drop in futile attacks against barbed wire. Germany, though victorious on the Eastern Front, saw its western lines beginning to buckle under the weight of hunger and a lack of resources. It was in this scenario of absolute despair that a new power decided to cross the Atlantic, bringing with it not just millions of fresh soldiers, but a philosophy of war that Europeans, in their arrogance, did not yet understand. When General John "Blackjack" Pershing landed with the American Expeditionary Force, he brought more than just men. He brought the raw firepower of a nation forged on the wild frontier. While the British and French prided themselves on the elegant precision of their Lee Enfield and Lebel rifles, the Americans knew that in the muddy chaos of a trench just 2 meters away, elegance was useless. What mattered was who could put the most metal into the air in the shortest time. At the heart of the American defense industry, the genius John Moses Browning had already anticipated this need decades earlier. The Winchester Model 1897 was not created for the trenches, but for the hunter who needed speed and absolute reliability in hostile environments. When the United States Navy and Army looked at the M97, they saw something beyond a hunting shotgun. They saw the definitive mechanical solution for the stalemate of European tunnels and defensive ditches. The construction of the M97 was a triumph of metallurgy for its time. The barrel was forged from nickel steel, capable of withstanding internal pressures that would make European weapons explode. The 20-inch short barrel design was not an accident, but a tactical necessity to allow the soldier to pivot his body quickly in corridors only a meter wide. Each part was manually adjusted to ensure that the mud and blood of the trenches would not stop the mechanism from working. What truly set the M97 apart from any other weapon on the battlefield was the intentional absence of a trigger disconnector. In the world of gun engineering, this is seen as a feature of simplicity, but in war, it became the feared slam fire. If the soldier kept the trigger pressed and simply operated the pump forend, the weapon fired the exact moment the shell was chambered. It was a manual 12-gauge machine gun that could drown a trench in lead in mere seconds. Imagine the shock of a German soldier, trained to count the slow shots of a Mauser rifle, upon encountering an American who did not stop firing. The rhythm of the slam fire was limited only by the speed of the shooter's arm, and in situations of pure adrenaline, a doughboy could empty 6 shells in less than 3 seconds. This meant that a single man was capable of projecting a wall of lead that no German defensive tactic had ever been trained to face or even psychologically endure. The ammunition used was another point of technical superiority that left the Kaiser's experts perplexed. The 12-gauge shells, initially made of waxed paper, were quickly replaced by versions made entirely of brass to prevent the humidity of France from swelling them. Each shell carried 9 high-density lead spheres known as 00 buckshot. A single shot was not just a projectile, it was a small individual artillery barrage that left no room for error or a chance for escape. In the hands of an American, the M97 was treated with the same naturalness as a farm tool. Many of these soldiers were experienced hunters who had grown up shooting at moving targets in dense forests. This muscle memory was translated to the trenches. While the German soldier had to aim carefully with his long Gewehr 98 rifle, the American simply pointed his Winchester instinctively and cleared everything within a 30-degree arc with a single rhythmic movement of the arm. The logistics behind this weapon were equally impressive. Winchester and Remington worked in double shifts, producing not only the weapon but the accessories that made it legendary. The perforated steel heat shield over the barrel was a brilliant addition, allowing the soldier to grip the weapon firmly even after firing dozens of shells. Without this shield, the heat generated by the friction of lead in the barrel would make the weapon impossible to handle after a few seconds. In addition to the firepower, the Americans equipped the M97 with the M1917 bayonet, a saber nearly 40 centimeters long. When mounted on the shotgun, the weapon transformed into a devastating short-range spear. German accounts describe the visual terror of seeing an American soldier emerging from the smoke, eyes fixed and a shotgun spitting fire and metal, topped by a blade that gleamed menacingly under the faint gray light of the early morning sun in the no-man's land. Training at American bases, such as Camp Devens, focused intensely on using the shotgun as a shock weapon. Soldiers were taught not to wait for the enemy, but to hunt them. They practiced instinctive shooting, learning to reload while moving, keeping the weapon always ready for the next unexpected encounter. This offensive mentality was the opposite of the European defensive doctrine, and the clash between these two realities would be as bloody as it was historically decisive. The first contacts the Germans had with the M97 occurred in sectors considered calm, but which quickly became slaughterhouses. German patrols attempting night raids were met not by isolated rifle shots, but by rhythmic explosions of lead that disintegrated entire squads in seconds. The silence of the night was torn apart by the mechanical sound of the Winchesters pumping, a sound that would soon become the primary trigger for absolute panic within the German defensive lines. The initial reaction of German officers was one of total technical disbelief. They did not understand how a single soldier could repel attacks from entire platoons. Upon examining the bodies of their men, they were horrified by the patterns of the wounds. Unlike the small puncture of an 8mm bullet, the American buckshot created multiple and massive traumas that made any attempt at first aid useless. The war had just become much more personal and much more terrifying for them. In letters sent home, German soldiers began to mention the barbarians' hunting tool. There was a growing sense that the Americans did not respect the aristocratic conventions of war. To the German soldier, fighting a tank or a cannon was something understandable within industrial logic, but being hunted like an animal in his own trench by a shotgun was a psychological humiliation that began to erode the morale of the Kaiser's troops from the very first encounter with the weapon. The German command, realizing morale was collapsing, initially tried to downplay the weapon's effectiveness, calling it inaccurate and made for cowards. However, the reality of the battlefield refuted the propaganda. Every time a sector was attacked by Americans armed with M97s, the number of German survivors was drastically lower than in attacks by British or French troops. American efficiency was beginning to speak louder than any imperial decree or desperate military boast. Sergeant Fred Lloyd became the living symbol of this technical efficiency and bravery. He was no ordinary soldier. He was the incarnation of the American hunter spirit, adapted for the European apocalypse. During the fighting in the Argonne Forest, Lloyd found himself separated from his platoon. Instead of hiding and waiting for rescue, he decided that the best defense would be a solitary offensive. He delved deep into the German lines, guided only by the sound of enemy voices. The forest was so dense that visibility was only a few meters, the perfect environment for the Winchester M97. Lloyd moved like a ghost, avoiding the main trails and flanking enemy machine gun positions. When he finally found the main artery of the German trench, he did not hesitate. He jumped into the ditch with his finger on the trigger, ready to test the mechanical limit of his weapon and the psychological endurance of his adversaries in the most brutal way possible. As Sergeant Fred Lloyd leaped into the enemy trench, he didn't just find soldiers, he landed amidst the entire nervous system of the German Imperial Army. The first impact was visual and sensory. He crashed onto a damp wooden walkway, the sound of his boots echoing like thunder in that narrow corridor. Before the first sentry could even scream, the Winchester M97 was already positioned. Lloyd's movements were pure instinct, shaped by years of hunting in the American wilderness. The first group of Germans was less than 5 meters away. They carried the Mauser rifle, an excellent weapon for long-range precision but slow and clumsy in tight spaces. As the German soldier attempted to cycle his rifle's bolt, Lloyd had already pulled the trigger of the M97. The explosion of sound was deafening in the confined space. The cloud of .00 buckshot tore through the air, hitting 3 men simultaneously, with a kinetic force that hurled them backward violently. Without releasing the trigger, Lloyd operated the pump forend with terrifying mechanical speed. The slam-fire feature took over. The sound was rhythmic, bup-clack, bup-clack. With every cycle, a new brass shell was ejected, and a new one fired the exact second the chamber closed. In less than 3 seconds, Lloyd had emptied 5 shells. The corridor, once buzzing with German soldiers at the ready, was now a scene of absolute destruction and a smoke-filled, heavy silence. The smoke from the gunpowder and hot metal filled the trench, hiding Lloyd like a specter of death. The Germans further back, around a bend in the corridor, heard the shots and couldn't understand what was happening. To them, the sound didn't seem to come from rifles but from a piece of artillery that had somehow been smuggled into the tunnel network. Panic began to spread. They shouted confused orders, but no one wanted to be the first to turn the corner and investigate. Lloyd took advantage of the panic to reload. His fingers moved with precision, inserting the heavy 12-gauge cartridges into the tube under the barrel. He felt the heat radiating from the steel heat shield, a feature of the M97 that was now proving its worth. Without this protector, his hands would have already been burned by the extreme temperature of the barrel. He was ready to continue. With every step he took, the sound of the pump action served as a psychological warning. Turning the next curve, Lloyd encountered a German officer trying to organize a defensive line with Luger pistols. The officer fired 2 shots that grazed Lloyd's helmet, but the American response was relentless. A single shot from the Winchester hit the officer in the chest, spreading the lead pellets in a deadly cone. The soldiers accompanying him, seeing their leader fall so brutally, threw their weapons to the ground and tried to flee deeper into the darkness of the trench. The hunt continued for nearly 200 meters through the trench network. Lloyd moved with an aggressiveness that European war manuals would have considered impossible for a single man. He wasn't just clearing corridors, he was neutralizing machine gun nests from behind. Surviving Germans began to report that they were facing an American demon carrying a weapon capable of firing storms of steel without the need for slow reloads or a fixed base. It was a total tactical shock. As Lloyd advanced, news of his feat began to reach American lines through messengers. The Allied command realized that the shotgun was not just a support weapon, but the tip of the spear for a new form of urban warfare applied to the trenches. Lloyd's account served as the basis for new combat manuals. However, the true impact was being felt on the other side, in the German field hospitals, where doctors were left in a state of absolute scientific and professional shock. German surgeons had never seen wounds caused by buckshot on an industrial scale. Unlike a rifle bullet that passes through the body cleanly, the lead spheres from the M97 entered in diverging trajectories, destroying internal organs and shattering bones in a way that made amputation the only option in most cases. German medical reports began to classify the American weapon as an instrument of technical torture, rather than a legitimate tool of war. It was a new kind of horror. This medical shock fueled German diplomacy. In Berlin, high-ranking officials of the Kaiser discussed how to neutralize the American advantage. They knew they couldn't produce an equivalent weapon in time, and that their soldiers were terrified. The solution found was legalistic. Germany decided to use the Hague Convention to attempt to ban the Winchester M97, claiming it caused unnecessary suffering and was contrary to the laws of humanity and the rules of modern warfare. The German protest document was laden with bitter hypocrisy. They argued that using multiple lead projectiles in a smoothbore weapon violated Article 23 of the Convention. The world watched in amazement as the nation that had introduced phosgene and chlorine gas against defenseless troops now complained about a pump-action shotgun. The protest was sent through the Swiss government, serving as a desperate attempt to save the failing morale of their frontline troops. When the protest reached Washington, the American government did not flinch. General Pershing was consulted, and his response was a landmark of American determination. He stated that the shotgun was a legitimate weapon of defense and offense, as valid as any cannon or rifle. Pershing went further and declared that if Germany carried out its threat to execute any American prisoners found with shotguns, the United States would retaliate by executing captured German officers. Pershing's harsh response was a strategic checkmate. Germany realized the Americans would not be intimidated by diplomacy and that the military superiority of their trench gun would continue to dominate the battlefields. The psychological effect on German soldiers was devastating. They knew that if they heard the metallic sound of the Winchester, no international law could save them from the impact of the 00 buckshot coming their way. It was the end of their perceived safety. The technical shock to the Germans also lay in the perception of American industrial quality. They examined captured weapons and were astonished by the precision of the adjustments and the durability of the materials. The Winchester M97 was proof that the United States industry was decades ahead in terms of mass production and standardization. Every part was interchangeable, something that European craft manufacturing still struggled to implement on such a large scale. In the trenches, the fear of the M97 changed how the Germans planned their counterattacks. They stopped trying short-range raids against American units identified as carrying shotguns. The German command ordered that these units be engaged only with heavy artillery, which was an implicit admission that their infantry stood no chance in hand-to-hand combat. The American shotgun had forced a total change in German doctrine, making their traditional tactics obsolete overnight. For the technical viewer, it's essential to understand that the M97 wasn't just effective because it was powerful, but because it was ergonomically superior for the stress of combat. The bottom loading system made it easy to feed the weapon even under heavy fire. The brass shells, though expensive, ensured the gun never jammed due to thermal expansion. It was the perfect combination of the ruggedness of a field tool and the sophistication of an elite combat weapon. Lloyd's account would end with him returning to American lines covered in mud and gunpowder, but without a single serious scratch. He had proven that the will of one man and the efficiency of a machine could change the course of a battle. His Winchester M97, with the heat shield still crackling from the heat, became a war trophy and a symbol that peace would only be achieved through an absolute and unquestionable military superiority. The legend was now immortalized. By the end of the war, the Steel Terror would continue to be the recurring nightmare of the Kaiser's generals. The attempt to ban it only served to immortalize the weapon and create an aura of invincibility around American soldiers. The German reaction to seeing American power was a mix of anger, technical envy, and a primal fear that no imperial ideology could appease. The era of American technological supremacy was just beginning to show its teeth to the world. While the mud of the French trenches swallowed lives and hopes, the gears of American industry turned with unprecedented speed. Winchester and Remington were not just factories, they were the beating heart of the American war effort. In New Haven, workers labored in 3 shifts to ensure every doughboy had his M97. Raw steel was transformed into precision instruments on a scale that German manufacturing simply could not match, marking the beginning of the end for the Kaiser. The scale of American production was the first sign of the impending German defeat. While Berlin struggled to find substitutes for copper and rubber, American foundries received unlimited ores from the vast mines of the continent. Every Winchester M97 that rolled off the assembly line was proof that the industrial war had changed hands. The Kaiser believed in traditional military discipline, but Washington believed in technologically superior mass production at a relentless pace. However, the perfect weapon faced a silent enemy: the extreme humidity of the trenches. The first paper-wrapped shells swelled in the mud, jamming the shotguns at the most critical moments of combat. For an American soldier, this was a death sentence. The solution required immediate engineering. The American government ordered the creation of shells made entirely of brass, a costly decision that ensured the M97 would never fail in the heat of battle, regardless of the filth. The brass shell was a technical marvel on its own. It not only resisted water and mud, but aided in the thermal extraction of the weapon. When the hot metal of the shell was ejected, it carried away part of the heat generated by the shot, allowing the M97's chamber to remain operational for much longer. This level of attention to logistical detail was what separated the American war machine from its European adversaries, who still relied on inferior and unstable materials. On the other side of the line, General Erich Ludendorff received increasingly grim reports. He saw reconnaissance photos and interrogated prisoners, realizing that the Americans were flooding the front with technology he could not contain. Ludendorff admitted in his memoirs that the industrial power of the United States was a factor Germany had fatally underestimated. For him, the M97 was the ultimate symbol of this unstoppable avalanche of new, high-quality American resources. The German defeat was not just physical, it was deeply moral and psychological. Seeing American soldiers arrive with brand-new equipment and shiny brass ammunition created a profound sense of inferiority in the German troops. The contrast was humiliating for an army that now wore uniforms made of recycled paper and boots made of plywood. German officers reported that their men felt they were fighting an army of the future, equipped with devastating and endless weapons. The sound of the M97's pump action became the definitive sound of defeat for the enemy. In the nights of the Argonne, the metallic echo of a Winchester reloading could be heard dozens of meters away, enough to make entire German platoons retreat in absolute silence. They knew that sound preceded a storm of lead that left no survivors. The weapon had become an instrument of psychological warfare, operating on the primitive fear of being hunted down like prey in the dark. It was during this period that the term devil dogs gained global traction, fueled by the aggression of Marines armed with their shotguns. The Germans tried to understand how men could run toward machine gun fire carrying only pump-action shotguns. The answer lay in training and the absolute confidence the American soldier had in his weapon. They knew if they reached 10 meters of the enemy, the M97 would resolve the dispute in seconds, with no margin for error or failure. Winchester's quality control was relentless and served as the industry standard. Each M97 passed through endurance tests that simulated years of use in just a few days of inspection. The nickel steel was tested against chemical corrosion, and the internal springs were calibrated not to fail under sub-zero temperatures. This technical rigor ensured that when a soldier entered an enemy trench, he had absolute certainty that his war machine would function without hesitation. Marshal Paul von Hindenburg also expressed his despair in internal communique to the High Command. He realized that Germany was no longer fighting a nation, but a different industrial planet. The ease with which the U.S. produced millions of brass cartridges and thousands of steel shotguns was something the German economy, strangled by the naval blockade, could never match. The war of attrition had become a war of technological manufacturing where Berlin was losing ground. For the technical viewer, it is fascinating to see how the American entrepreneurial spirit infiltrated military design. The M97 was intuitive and easy to maintain, allowing any young farmer from Kansas to become an elite operator in just a few weeks. This ease of use reduced training time and increased effectiveness on the battlefield. While Germany required years to train its specialists, the U.S. created lethal combatants in months through superior technology and design. Transatlantic logistics was the greatest engineering feat of the Great War. Ships loaded with Winchester M97s crossed the ocean in convoys protected by destroyers, facing U-boat submarines to deliver the steel terror into the hands of the combatants. Each crate of weapons that arrived at the port was a nail in the coffin of the German Empire. American success was not just a victory of bravery, but a triumph of the supply chain over the enemy's fanatical resistance. The German shock with American military power often turned into bitter resentment and diplomatic excuses. In their reports, German officers mocked the lack of warrior culture of the Americans, claiming they won only through industrial brute force rather than honor. However, behind this arrogance was the painful recognition that the world had changed. The honor of European chivalry had been replaced by the unstoppable reality of American mass production. In late 1918, the German Stoßtruppen, or stormtrooper tactic, met its ultimate nemesis in the M97. Where the Germans once broke lines through quick attacks and grenades, they now found American soldiers armed with shotguns who struck them down before they could even throw their explosives. The U.S. short-range superiority neutralized the last German tactical innovation, forcing the Berlin High Command to accept that a military victory was now physically impossible. This third stage of our journey shows Germany in shambles, while the United States rose as the new workshop of the modern world. The M97 was the personification of this historic transition. It was not just a weapon, but an announcement that the 20th century would belong to those who could unite science and industry. The German panic was only the first symptom of a new global power balance being forged with every accurate shot of 12-gauge American lead. The Hindenburg Line was considered the peak of German defensive engineering, a wall of concrete, barbed wire, and machine gun nests that was supposed to be impenetrable. To the Kaiser's generals, this line was not just a defense, but a statement of technical superiority over the Allied forces. However, they did not foresee that the impact of a single short-range weapon, multiplied by thousands of American soldiers, would be the catalyst for the collapse of their entire system. The final assault against the Hindenburg Line revealed the true face of modern warfare. While British tanks carved paths through the wire, it was the doughboys, armed with their Winchester M97s, who performed the grim work of clearing concrete bunkers. The internal environment of these fortifications was the ideal stage for the steel terror. In spaces where the long barrel of a Mauser rifle was a hindrance, the M97's agility allowed the Americans to dominate every room in seconds. The American tactic was as simple as it was brutal: a grenade followed by a burst of slam fire. German soldiers who survived the initial explosion were immediately met by a rain of lead that left no room for surrender or counterattack. The psychological impact of seeing their most protected bunkers taken with such ease destroyed the last hope of the German high command. They realized that concrete and steel were no match for the industrial aggression and the new tools of the U.S. Declassified interrogation reports from years later show the depth of the German shock. A non-commissioned officer captured at St. Quentin described the encounter with a group of American Marines as a technological massacre. He reported that his men, veterans of 4 years of war, simply dropped their weapons upon hearing the sound of the shotguns. According to him, there was no honor in fighting a weapon that turned a soldier into a piece of meat in mere milliseconds of action. Another German officer, in a statement taken by Allied intelligence, compared the Winchester M97 to a portable hand cannon. He was obsessed with the idea that the Americans had mechanized even individual combat. For this officer, the German defeat was not caused by a lack of courage, but by a glaring technological inequality. He saw in the M97 the proof that Germany had fallen behind in the race for small arms modernization, a mistake that would ultimately cost them their empire. The technical durability of the M97 during these final offensives was what cemented its legend. While other weapons jammed due to concrete dust and gunpowder residue, the Winchester continued to operate with a rugged reliability. John Browning's design, with few moving parts and generous mechanical tolerances, proved superior to the more refined but fragile European designs. American simplicity defeated German complexity in the supreme test of the muddy and blood-soaked battlefield. With the armistice in November 1918, the fame of the forbidden weapon did not die. It simply changed its theater of operation. Thousands of these weapons returned to the United States with the veterans, and the government quickly realized that the effectiveness demonstrated in the trenches would be perfect for law enforcement. It was the birth of the modern riot gun. The M97 became the standard tool for police patrols facing gangsters with the same authority it showed in France. The legacy of the M97 in the Great War defined what we now know as special forces and elite units. The idea of a small, highly mobile unit equipped with high short-range firepower was born in the muddy corridors of France with the trench gun. Today, any SWAT unit or special operations team that utilizes a tactical shotgun owes its doctrine to the doughboys of 1918 and their stubbornness in using a hunting tool against an empire that tried so desperately to ban its use. The German reaction throughout the conflict serves as the greatest historical praise for American industry. The panic, the diplomatic protest, and the deep-seated hatred were symptoms of an enemy that knew it was being surpassed at every level. The Americans did not just win the war. They transformed it into an industrial process of threat elimination. The Winchester M97 was the ultimate symbol of this transformation, a bridge between the past and the future of firepower. Looking back, the story of the forbidden weapon is a reminder of what happens when American technical creativity meets the urgent need of the battlefield. The success of the United States in the Great War was not just a matter of numbers, but of knowing how to choose the right tool for the hardest job. The M97 was that tool, a piece of steel and wood that silenced the Kaiser's machine guns and ensured that the 20th century was shaped under the shadow of American power. When the clock struck the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, a strange silence took over the plains of France. For the soldiers in the trenches, that auditory vacuum was more deafening than any artillery barrage. Slowly, heads covered by steel helmets emerged over the earthen parapets. On one side, the Americans; on the other, the Germans. Hate had been replaced by an exhaustion that transcended borders, but the technical memory of the conflict remained. The doughboys, who weeks earlier ran frantically with their Winchesters in hand, now looked at their weapons with a strange melancholy. The M97, which had been the instrument of their survival and the reaper of their enemies, now seemed heavy and out of place in a world asking for peace. They cleaned the nickel steel for the last time before packing it into transport crates, knowing that every scratch on the walnut stock told a story of terror that the world would never forget. On the German side, the sight of the Americans leaving the trenches was accompanied by a feeling of relief tinged with bitterness. Many Kaiser's veterans remained motionless, watching the distant figures of the men who carried the feared trench gun. For them, the war had not ended only in political defeat, but in a technical humiliation. They had been confronted with the future of violence, and that future spoke the mechanical dialect of John Moses Browning and his machines. Reports from German soldiers who walked through the newly liberated areas described the trail left by American shotguns with traumatic clarity. They avoided looking directly into certain parts of the trenches where the buckshot had done its work. For these men, the M97 was not just a weapon, but a force of nature that had violated the laws of war probability. They felt they had survived an encounter with something that shouldn't exist in a civilized or even a modern world. The return of American heroes was a spectacle of national pride. But for the men who carried the Winchesters, the homecoming was lonely in spirit. They walked the streets of New York with the look of those who had seen the abyss. Many kept their service weapons, hiding them under beds or in attics, as if they expected the metallic sound of the pump action to be necessary again at any moment to protect their peace. The steel terror had moved from the front line to the home. The psychological impact of the M97 on post-war Germany was so deep that the topic continued to be discussed in military circles for decades. The trauma of the invisible lead became a metaphor for the entry of the United States onto the world stage, a force that did not follow European traditions and that resolved conflicts with devastating industrial efficiency. The German Empire had fallen, but the ghost of the forbidden weapon would remain alive in the minds of many. The history of the Winchester Model 1897 is, ultimately, the story of how technical engineering can become a myth. It was not just a tool made of metal, but the first chapter of a new book on global supremacy. The shock of the enemies upon seeing American power was not an isolated event, but the beginning of an era where a nation's will would be measured by the lethality of its inventions. The steel terror silenced the Kaiser, and its echo still rings today in history. We end our narrative under the pale sun of a European November, where the blood has dried, but the legend remains fresh. The world changed, empires fell, and new ones rose. But the mechanical sound of a Winchester being cocked is still the universal sound that the Americans have arrived to decide the fate of history. And against that, as the Kaiser discovered too late, there is no diplomatic protest or trench that can resist the industrial and cinematic power of the U.S. The 11th hour of the 11th day brought a silence that felt heavier than the 4 years of thunder that preceded it. Across the jagged remains of the Western Front, the mechanical hymn of the Winchester M97 finally faded into the mist. American doughboys sat on the edges of their muddy craters, the steel terror resting across their laps. For the first time in months, they weren't looking for a target. They were looking at the weapon that had become their grim soulmate in the dark. From the opposite side of no man's land, the survivors of the German Imperial Army watched in a state of hollow disbelief. To them, the Americans weren't just victors. They were the heralds of a new, terrifying world. The German veterans, who once prided themselves on the honor of the bayonet and the precision of the Mauser, looked at the shotguns with a mixture of hatred and awe. They had seen their comrades erased by a weapon that didn't care for the old rules of engagement. As the Americans began the slow process of cleaning their gear for the journey home, the M97 required one last ritual. The soldiers wiped away the gray mud of the Meuse Argonne from the nickel steel barrels. They looked at the walnut stalks, often scarred and stained with the residue of a violence that words could never capture. Each scratch was a memory of a bunker cleared, a corridor silenced, or a night raid that had been turned into a slaughter by the power of the slam fire. In the prisoner of war camps, the interrogation of German officers continued long after the guns fell silent. The transcripts of these sessions reveal a recurring obsession with the American shotgun. One high-ranking Prussian officer refused to believe that the M97 was a standard-issue weapon. He was convinced it was a secret experimental device designed to demoralize his troops. He couldn't grasp that the Americans had simply taken a hunting tool and industrialized it for the apocalypse. The German community also struggled to process the aftermath of the Steel Terror. Field surgeons documented the ballistic trauma with a clinical horror that still resonates in historical archives. They spoke of the shattered morale of the infantry, noting that soldiers would rather face a gas attack than a squad of Americans armed with shotguns. The weapon had achieved something that no artillery piece could. It had made the very act of standing one's ground feel like a foolish suicide. For the American soldiers returning home, the M97 was a bridge between two worlds. As they boarded the great transport ships in Brest and Saint-Nazaire, they carried the knowledge that they were the first generation of a global superpower. The shotgun was the physical proof of that status. It represented a nation that didn't wait for permission to innovate, a nation that looked at a tactical stalemate and solved it with the raw, uncompromising efficiency of mass-produced steel. Back in the United States, the legend of the forbidden weapon only grew. The veterans who kept their service shotguns brought back more than just metal. They brought back a new doctrine of combat. The government quickly realized that the M97's ability to dominate a room was just as valuable on the streets of Chicago as it was in the trenches of France. It became the definitive tool for law enforcement during the violent years of Prohibition, facing down gangsters with authority. The mechanical soul of the M97 lived on in every design that followed. John Moses Browning had created a blueprint that defied the passage of time. The pump-action mechanism, once a tool for the wild frontier and then a terror for the German Empire, became the standard for tactical units worldwide. Even today, when a modern operator racks a shotgun in a dark hallway, the sound is the same one that made the hearts of the Kaiser's stormtroopers skip a beat in 1918. The German reaction to the M97 remained a point of national trauma for years, influencing their own military development leading up to the next great conflict. They never forgot the feeling of being technologically outclassed in the mud. The protest of 1918 was their admission that the age of the aristocratic warrior was dead, replaced by the era of the American industrial soldier. The Steel Terror had not just cleared a trench, it had cleared the way for the American century. In the final cinematic fade-out of this story, we see a lone Winchester M97 resting in a museum display, its surface polished, but its history unyielding. It stands as a silent witness to the moment when American ingenuity met the most desperate need of the human race. It reminds us that in the darkest corridors of history, the right tool, wielded with courage and backed by an unstoppable industry, can change the fate of empires and silence the drums of war with a single, decisive blast. The story of the M97 is the story of America itself, robust, unapologetic, and incredibly effective under pressure. It was the weapon the enemy tried to ban because they knew they could never hope to match its spirit or its fire. As the echoes of the Great War fade into the past, the Steel Terror remains a legend of the frontier that went to sea, crossed an ocean, and returned as the undisputed champion of the modern battlefield, a legacy of power that will never be forgotten. The final testament of the M97 is found in the respect of those who had to face it. No other weapon in the history of the First World War triggered such a visceral, desperate reaction from a superpower. The American shotgun was the ultimate checkmate, a triumph of the common man's ingenuity over the rigid structures of an old empire. It was, and always will be, the forbidden weapon that ensured the light of freedom would never be extinguished by the shadows of the trenches.